Welcome back to Marked by Midnight. Tonight's legend is not a story about a woman who begged for love. It is a story about a woman who was left to die and chose, instead, to burn. Before this night is over, you will watch a king lose everything he thought was his. You will watch a girl the world called broken become the most feared soul in the ancient realm. And you will see that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is walk straight into the darkness and dare it to swallow them whole. Settle in. The moon is already rising, and the hunt has only just begun. Chapter 1. The night of the Great Moor ceremony came the way all terrible things come. Slowly at first, and then all at once. The sky above the Thousand Oak Dominion had turned the deep, bruised red of a wound that refused to close. The ancient oaks that ringed the high stone were older than memory itself. Their roots sunk so deep into the earth that the elders said they drank from the same dark water that fed the bones of the first wolves. Their bark was the color of dried blood. Their branches reached upward like the hands of something that had been buried alive and was still trying to claw its way out. Every den in the Dominion had emptied for this night. Warriors in their darkest furs stood shoulder to shoulder across the valley floor. Mothers pressed their cubs close. The old and the scarred and the battle-worn all raised their faces to the high stone, their eyes shining with the ancient hunger for ceremony, for the binding, for the mark, for the sacred claim that tied two souls into one. At the center of it all stood Luciana. She wore white, not the rich, the moon-bleached white of a favored mate, but the dull, thin white of someone who had been handed a garment and told to be grateful for it. Her dark hair was unbound, falling loose around her bare shoulders. She stood very still on the stone platform at the foot of the high stone, her hands clasped in front of her, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd's heads, where the sky was the darkest shade of red. She did not tremble. She had promised herself that much. Whatever happened tonight, she would not tremble. She had known in the private chambers of her own heart for a long time that something was wrong. She had known it in the way Bailey looked at her, or rather, in the way he never quite looked at her. There was always something just past her shoulder that held his gaze, some more interesting thing, or some more worthy thing. She had learned to shrink herself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into the narrow space he seemed willing to allow her, the way a tree will grow sideways if the light only comes from one direction. She had told herself it was temporary. She had told herself that once the ceremony came, once the bond was sealed, everything would change. She had been wrong. Bailey descended the high stone, the way kings always descend things, slowly, letting every eye in the valley find him before he moved another inch. He was enormous, a wall of muscle and old power, his dark fur cloak sweeping behind him as he came. The Dominion's warriors parted for him, the way the roots of the great oaks parted around stone. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of something deeper. Something that lived below fear in the marrow. He stopped 10 paces from Luciana. He looked at her, and she saw it immediately. Not hesitation, not regret. Just nothing. A flat, still surface where warmth should have been. The valley went quiet in the way that only very large crowds can go quiet. A deep, held-breath silence that pressed against the ears. Bailey's voice, when it came, carried all the way to the tree line and beyond. I will not waste my mark on a hollow vessel. The silence shattered, not into noise, into a terrible, collective stillness that was somehow worse. Every wolf in the valley heard those words. Every soul in the Dominion heard them. They fell on Luciana like stones dropped from a great height, each one landing square. He was not finished. "You are mute-souled," he said, loud enough for the ancient oaks to hear. "You cannot shift. You cannot howl. You carry no power in your blood. I will not stain my lineage by binding myself to a ghost." He turned then, not slowly this time, but with the brisk, efficient movement of a man disposing of a matter that had already taken too much of his attention. He raised one hand, and from the crowd came a figure Luciana had been trying very hard not to look at all evening. Sasha. She moved through the crowd the way a blade moves through water, smoothly, decisively, without apology. She was everything Luciana was not, or at least everything the Dominion had decided mattered. Her shift was powerful. Her howl could crack bark on the great oaks from 50 paces. She wore her confidence the way others wore armor, and she climbed the high stone and stood at Bailey's right hand, as though she had been standing there in her dreams for years, and was only now catching up to reality. Bailey did not look at Luciana again. He sank his teeth into the curve of Sasha's neck, not gently, not ceremonially, but with the full, declaring force of a king making a point. And Sasha threw her head back and let out a howl that split the blood-red sky wide open. The crowd erupted. Luciana stood in the middle of it all and felt something inside her chest tear like old cloth. It was not precisely grief. It was not even heartbreak, not the way songs described heartbreak, hot and dramatic and full of tears. It was colder than that. It was the specific, quiet devastation of a person watching the last door close. She walked off the stone platform, alone. No one stopped her. No one moved to touch her shoulder. No one followed. She walked until the noise of the ceremony was behind her, and the dark of the forest was ahead. And then she walked further still, until there was only the sound of her own feet on the cold earth and the far-away howling of the Dominion, celebrating something she would never be part of. She did not cry. She walked. 3 months passed. The silver blight came slowly at first. A greyness at the edges of her vision when she woke each morning, a heaviness in her chest that felt like breathing through wet cloth. She noticed the veins along her left wrist first. They had darkened to the colour of old bruises, tracing a creeping pattern up toward her elbow. By the 2nd month, the coughing had started. It happened at night, mostly, when the bond that Bailey had left, half-formed and rotting, tried to assert itself from its own death. She would press her face into the thick fur of her sleeping mat and cough until she tasted copper, and then lie very still in the dark and stare at the ceiling of the small den she had been given on the outer edge of the Dominion. A rejected bond did not simply disappear. It decayed. And as it decayed, it took the one it had marked for death along with it, slowly, agonizingly, cell by cell, like a vine that had been cut from its root and was still green enough to believe it might survive. Luciana knew what was happening to her. She had visited Gilbert, the Dominion's head healer, in the 2nd week after the rejection. He was an old wolf, all grey muzzle and careful eyes, his den lined with clay jars of dried herbs and hanging bundles of bark. She had shown him her wrist. He had looked at it for a long time, then looked at her, and his careful eyes had shifted sideways in a way she had not known how to read at the time. "Rest," he had said. "Drink the tonic I prepare for you. It will help." It had not helped. It had never helped. But she had kept drinking it, because what else was there to do? She was alone in every way a person can be alone. The Dominion's wolves looked at her the way wolves look at the injured member of a run, with a mixture of pity and wariness, already calculating the distance between themselves and whatever misfortune clung to her. Bailey did not acknowledge her existence. Sasha, now marked and elevated, moved through the Dominion stone halls with a proprietorial ease that made the whole world feel like it had been reorganized around her absence. Luciana endured, because endurance was what she had. It was on the night of the new moon, the darkest night, the night the ancient Dominion said belonged to secrets and sharp knives, that she crept to the edge of the cradle where Bailey and Sasha had their quarters. She had not meant to. Her feet had simply carried her there the way water finds the lowest point. She pressed herself against the cold stone of the outer wall and listened. Through the bond, even rotting, even decaying, the thread of it still connected her to Bailey like a fishhook through her sternum. She felt it. Not his emotions, not his thoughts, but a resonance of warmth, a sense of being chosen, of being wanted, of all the things she had thought were waiting for her on the other side of the ceremony. They were all there. They were all real. They just belonged to someone else. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone and breathed. 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 And then something settled in her chest. Not peace, not resignation, but something harder than both. Something with teeth. She thought, if I stay here, I die in this silence. She thought, dying quietly in a corner of the Dominion is still dying. She thought, if I am going to die, I will do it on my own terms, in my own direction, moving forward. There was only one place left to go, only one door left to knock on, and it was the most dangerous door in the known world, the Bone Ridge, the territory of Matthias Kane, the king of bone and blood. Luciana walked back to her small den, she sat on the edge of her sleeping mat, and began to plan. Chapter 2. She left before the first light grayed the eastern sky. She took only what she could carry in her arms, a thick fur wrap, a small knife with a bone handle, and a water skin that she knew would not last her the full journey. She left the tonic Gilbert prepared behind. She tipped it out of its clay jar and watched it pool on the stone floor of the den, dark and faintly bitter-smelling, and felt a grim satisfaction she could not entirely explain. She did not leave a note. There was no one to write one for. The outer edges of the Thousand Oak Dominion were marked by the boundary stones, great, hunched boulders carved with the old sigils, the warning language of the ancient dens. Beyond them, the forest changed character immediately. The trees grew closer together, their canopies thickening until the sky above was only visible in narrow, knife-thin slices. The undergrowth was dense with briar. Not ordinary briar, but the forbidden kind, the kind the Dominion's elders called the thorn cradle, with thorns the length of a finger and edges sharp enough to open skin to the bone. Luciana pushed through it. Every step was work. The thorns caught at her wrap, tore at her bare arms, raked across her cheeks. She bled freely in a dozen places, the kind of bright, immediate pain that is almost a relief after months of the slower, duller pain of the silver blight. She moved with her chin down, her shoulders turned, using her arms to shield her face, pressing forward even when the briar was so thick she could not see more than 3 paces ahead. She thought of nothing but forward. The Bone Ridge itself began where the briar ended, or rather, where the briar grew so thick and low that it turned into a kind of wall, and the only way through was up. The ridge was a spine of grey rock that jutted from the earth at an angle, like something colossal had struck the ground from below and driven it upward. The rock was jagged and pale, and in the thin morning light it did look, precisely, like bone, like the earth itself had broken open, and what was underneath was not dirt, but skeleton. Luciana climbed. Her hands found cracks in the rock face that were just wide enough for fingers. Her boots scraped against surfaces that offered only centimeters of purchase. The silver blight made her arms heavier than they should have been, made her lungs burn on the steep sections, made her pause and press her forehead against the cold rock and simply breathe until the black spots at the edges of her vision retreated. She climbed. At the top of the ridge, she stood on the highest point and looked out over the territory that spread below her. The Bone Ridge fell away on the far side into a valley that was darker than anything she had seen on the Dominion side. The trees here were different, older, heavier, their bark almost black with age, their roots climbing over each other and over the rocks in thick, knotted masses. No blood-red sky here. The light that filtered through the canopy was grey-green, cold, like the light at the bottom of deep water. There were no boundary stones. There were no sigils. There was only the sense of something very large and very old watching from between the trees. She descended. She had been walking for perhaps an hour through the valley's floor when she heard them. She smelled them first, iron and old earth and something sharper, something wild that had no name in the Dominion's vocabulary, the smell of a thing that had never been tamed and had no intention of starting. She kept walking, because stopping would not help her, and because she had come too far to be frightened by a smell. They came from between the trees without sound, 2 of them. The one on the left was built like a cliff face, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet stillness in his posture that speaks of someone who does not need to move to be threatening. His face was weathered, carved into hard angles by a life lived outdoors in all seasons. He wore dark leather and furs so old they had begun to take on the same color as the trees around them. The one on the right was leaner and darker, with cold eyes that assessed her the way a wolf assesses prey, not with cruelty, but with the purely practical interest of something deciding whether a thing is worth the trouble of eating. They stopped 6 paces from her. "You are bleeding," the lean one said. Not with concern. With the same flat observation one might apply to a tree that was missing its bark. Luciana looked down at her arms. The briar had done considerable work. She looked back up at them. "Yes," she said. "You came through the thorn cradle." The cliff-faced one looked at the scratches on her cheeks, the dark pattern of the silver blight visible along her bare forearm, where her wrap had slid back. His gaze held there for a moment. "I did." A silence. "You are from the Dominion?" It was not a question. I was. The lean one moved first, not toward her, but to circle slightly, the old instinctive movement of a predator finding angle. His nostrils flared. She watched him process what he was smelling, the rotting bond, the silver blight, the particular scent of the Dominion's eastern dens that she had never quite been able to wash out of her skin. "You are dying," he said. "Not yet." She let that word sit. Then she said the thing she had rehearsed on the long climb over the ridge, the thing she had rolled around in her mouth for weeks until it was smooth enough to say without her voice breaking. "Take me to your king. I offer my breath for his bite." The words fell into the cold air of the valley and sat there. The 2 wolves looked at each other. Something passed between them. The quick, wordless communication of wolves who have fought alongside each other for long enough that they no longer need language for everything. The cliff-faced one, she would learn later that his name was Henry, turned back to her. "Walk," he said. She walked. They brought her through the valley for the better part of an hour before the trees thinned, and she saw the Bone Lair for the first time. She had expected something like the Dominion Stone Hall, large and grand and decorated with the symbols of power, the kind of architecture that spent most of its energy trying to tell you how important it was. What she found instead was something that made the Dominion's hall feel like a performance. The Bone Lair was carved directly into the face of a cliff, or not built against it, carved into it, so that the rock itself was the walls and the ceiling and the floor, worn smooth by centuries of use until it gleamed in the low firelight like the inside of a shell. The entrance was framed by two enormous pillars of the pale ridge rock, and between them hung heavy firs that moved in the cold draught from inside. Fires burned low inside, not the bright, ambitious fires of the Dominion's hall, but deep, red-orange fires banked into clay pits, the kind of fires built for warmth rather than display. Torches of oiled wood threw long shadows up the walls. The smell inside was deep and layered. Smoke and old leather, and something mineral, like rain on stone, and underneath it all something animal and warm that her silver-blighted senses could not quite identify. Warriors lined the walls, or not standing at attention, lounging, sharpening their blades, speaking in low voices, but every single one of them watched her as Henry and the lean wolf, Jude, she had caught his name in passing, brought her through the entrance and down into the main chamber. She kept her chin up. She felt their eyes moving over her in the same way she had felt Bailey's warriors look at her after the rejection, with that mixture of curiosity and dismissal, trying to determine what category of thing she was, threat or pity case, wolf or ghost. She kept walking, and then she saw Matthias. Chapter 3. He was seated, not standing, which surprised her. She had expected ceremony, throne and display, the full performance of power. Instead, Matthias sat at the far end of the main chamber on a low bench covered in dark fur, and bent over something on the table in front of him. A map, she thought, or a letter, she could not tell. He was not looking at her. He was still writing, or drawing, or tracing something on the surface of whatever lay before him, moving with the unhurried focus of someone who had decided that whatever was coming could wait until he was finished. He was huge. That was the first thing she registered. Not in the loud, performative way of Bailey's bulk, which was the deliberate bulk of a man who had trained himself to be imposing. Matthias was simply built the way old things are built, completely, fully, without wasted material. His shoulders were broad and heavily muscled beneath a dark tunic that was unlaced at the throat, and the forearms that rested on the table were roped with lean to hard muscle and crossed with the faint silver-white lines of old scars. His hair was dark, long enough to brush his collar at the back, loose around his face. His jaw was heavy and unshaved, dark with several days' growth. His face, in the firelight, was the face of someone who had lived in difficult country for a long time and had found the experience clarifying rather than exhausting. He finished what he was writing. He set down the bone-handled stylus. He looked up at her. His eyes were grey, the particular grey of storm sky after the worst of the weather has passed. Not soft, not gentle, but strangely clear. They moved over her the way a scout's eyes move over a landscape, methodically, without performance, cataloguing. She watched him note the silver blight on her forearm, the briar scratches, the thinness of her face, or the steadiness of her chin. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Henry says you walked through the thorn cradle." "I did." "Alone?" "Yes." Another pause. He stood, and the change in height was considerable. He was half a head taller than she had estimated from his seated position, and the full proportions of him, upright, were something her tired mind filed away as significant. He crossed the chamber toward her without hurry. His scouts stepped back without being told. The chamber, which had been murmuring with low conversations when she entered, was now very quiet. He stopped 2 paces from her. Up close, she could smell what she had not been able to name before. That deep, layered animal warmth. Rain on stone. Old roots. Or something her silver-blighted senses had no category for. something that resonated low in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the rotting bond and everything to do with something much older and much less explicable. She told herself to ignore it. She had more important things to do than notice how Matthias Kane smelled. "You're from Bailey's Dominion," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of geography. I was. His grey eyes dropped briefly to her wrist, the dark veins, the silver blight climbing toward her elbow. When he looked back up, his expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted slightly. Sharpened. "You have 3 weeks, maybe 4. She did not flinch. "I know. And you came here because dying in silence in the Thousand Oak Dominion is still dying." She held his gaze. "I would rather spend whatever time I have left choosing my own direction." A beat. "The plea you spoke to my scouts," he said. "You know what it means, what you were asking for. I know exactly what it means." He studied her for a long moment. She had the distinct sensation of being weighed, not found wanting, not found sufficient, but genuinely assessed, which was so different from Bailey's reflexive dismissal that it landed somewhere in her chest, like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. "Luciana," he said. It was the first time anyone had said her name in 3 months, as though it meant something. She held herself very still. "Why would I take a dying wolf from the Thousand Oak Dominion? What do you offer me that I cannot simply take from Bailey through war?" She had thought about this question for a long time on the climb over the ridge. She had turned it over and looked at it from every angle, the way you examine a stone for its fault lines. And she had arrived at the only honest answer she possessed. "Nothing," she said. "I offer you nothing that you couldn't take by force. I have no army. I have no power that anyone here can see. I have only myself, and I am asking you to take that." His chin lifted slightly. "I am asking you," she continued, her voice steady and quiet, "not because I believe I deserve saving. I am asking because I am not willing to lie down in his territory and disappear." Silence stretched between them. The fires crackled. Juan Matthias looked at her with those storm-grey eyes for what felt like a very long time. And then, slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone making a decision they intend to keep, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Something more complicated than that. He turned and spoke to Henry. "Prepare the sacred springs, and find her something to eat." Henry nodded and moved without comment. Matthias turned back to her. He did not touch her. He simply looked at her with those clear grey eyes and said, quietly and without performance, "You are not a ghost, Luciana. I don't know what you are yet. But you are not that." She had not cried in 3 months. She did not cry now, but something small and knotted and agonizing in the very center of her chest loosened, just fractionally, just enough to breathe around. She followed Henry toward the back of the bone lair. Matthias did not sleep that night. He sat by the low fire in the far chamber, long after the last of his warriors had settled, and he turned the information of her over in his mind, the way he would turn a weapon in his hands, feeling for balance, for the weight of it, for the place where it was most likely to change things. He had known about Luciana in the abstract, Bailey's unmated mate, the one the Dominion's gossip ran with, the mute-souled girl, the hollow vessel, the ghost who couldn't shift. He had filed the information away as irrelevant. Bailey's domestic arrangements were Bailey's problem. But there had been something wrong with the smell of her that his mind kept returning to. Or under the silver blight, under the copper of the rejected bond and the particular sour note of wolfsbane that clung to her skin in a way she clearly had no idea about, there had been something else. something he had not encountered in 15 years of ruling territory and running wars and dealing with every kind of wolf the ancient lands produced. Something that had gone very still inside him the moment she walked into the chamber. Something that had recognized her. He did not know what to do with that yet. He watched the fire burn down and thought about it, and the night outside the bone lair was very quiet and very cold, and somewhere in the dark corridor toward the sacred springs, a woman who should have been dead already was still, somehow, alive. Chapter 4. The sacred springs were in a deep chamber at the back of the bone lair, accessible through a passage carved so low that Luciana had to duck. The chamber opened out into a space that made her stop in the entrance and look. Hot springs fed by underground heat gathered in natural basins carved into the black rock, and the steam that rose from them caught the light of the wall torches and turned it gold. The water itself was a deep mineral blue, perfectly clear at the edges, dark at the center where it was deepest. The walls of the chamber were laced with thin mineral deposits that formed patterns across the rock face, white and rust-red and pale gold, like old writing in a language no one had spoken for 1,000 years. It smelled of iron and earth, and something ancient and clean, like the first water in the world, before anything had lived long enough to make it complicated. A young female warrior, broad-shouldered and serious-faced, introduced as Rena, helped her to the nearest basin without comment or ceremony, and Luciana was too tired and in too much pain to feel self-conscious about any of it. She sank into the water and felt it immediately, the heat seeping into the cold places the silver blight had been carving out for months, moving through her muscles like a slow, warm tide. She stayed in the water for a long time. When she climbed out, Rena was waiting with furs, not thin ones, not the courtesy furs of a guest room, but the deep, heavy, well-cured furs of someone's personal sleeping quarters. Luciana ran her fingers over the texture of them and did not ask whose they were. She slept. For the first time in 3 months, she slept without coughing, without the half-conscious misery of the silver blight pressing against her chest, without the thread of the rotting bond twitching at her sternum like a hook in a current. She slept deeply and completely, and if she dreamed, she did not remember the dreams, only a sensation of warmth, of weight, of something large and steady nearby. She found Matthias in the morning at the entrance to the bone lair, watching the valley below with the focused attention of a man who had learned to read a landscape the way others read text. She stood beside him without speaking for a moment, letting the cold air of the valley fill her lungs. The silver blight was still there, the dark veins, the heavy chest, but it had retreated very slightly in the night, as though the springs had pushed it back a centimetre or two, not enough to matter in any long-term sense, but enough to feel. "You slept," he said. He did not look at her. "I did. The springs help. They won't reverse the blight, but they slow it." She absorbed that. How long would they slow it? Weeks, months if you used them daily. He turned to look at her then, those grey eyes direct and unhurried. There is only one thing that would end it. She held his gaze. "I know." A pause. "I need to know something," he said. "Ask. Did you come here because you want to live, or because you want to spite Bailey?" The question was a good one. She thought about it honestly, because he deserved honesty, and because she had nothing left to lose by offering it. "Both," she said. "But mostly the first. I want to live. Oh, I have always wanted to live. I just never had an option that pointed in that direction before." He was quiet for a moment. "I won't claim a woman who is not choosing me," he said. "Not as a cure. Not as a transaction." Something moved through her at those words that she could not quite name. She looked at him, at the serious, steady face, the old scars, the grey eyes that held nothing performative in them, nothing that was trying to be impressive. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, given how long her thinking had been muddied by the blight, this is a different kind of man entirely. "What if I said I was choosing you?" she asked. Her voice was very quiet. "Not because you are the only option, but because standing here next to you, I feel something I haven't felt in 3 months. He waited. "Safe," she said, but the word sat between them in the cold morning air. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he reached out and took her left hand, not roughly, not possessively, but with the careful steadiness of someone handling something they consider worth being careful with, and turned her wrist over to look at the silver blight. His thumb moved just slightly across the dark veins. She did not pull away. "Tonight," he said, "we begin." That night, he dismissed his scouts from the outer corridor of the sacred springs. Luciana stood at the edge of the nearest basin and watched Matthias move through the chamber. He had brought herbs she didn't recognize, dark bundles of them, which he added to the water with a quiet, focused deliberateness. He had brought an oil lamp, small and brass, and set it on a ledge of rock so the light fell warm and even rather than harsh. He moved as if the space belonged to him without apology, which it did, and yet she never once felt crowded by his presence the way she had always felt crowded by Bailey's. Bailey had taken up space as a statement. Matthias took up space as a fact. When the herbs had diffused into the water and the steam had taken on a dark, resinous quality that made her lungs open, he turned to her. In the lamplight, the scars across his forearms and the base of his throat were more visible, each one a story she did not know yet, white and silver against warm skin. "The blight will resist," he said. "When I am near it, it will push back. I know. It will be painful. I know that too." He stepped closer, not crowding her, not claiming her, or simply closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth radiating from him across the small space of air that separated them, and her silver-blighted lungs took their first full breath in months without effort. She tipped her face up. He looked down at her for a long moment, reading something in her expression. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because the careful stillness of his posture shifted. Not much, but enough, into something that was warmer and less armored. His hands came up slowly, framing her face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with his size. One warm palm against her jaw, one against her temple, tilting her face toward his with the particular kind of care that belongs to people who are very strong and have learned to be precise with it. "Tell me," he said softly. "Tell me to stop, and I stop." She reached up and took his wrist, not to pull his hand away, to hold it there. "Don't stop," she said. And then his mouth found hers. It was nothing like she had expected. She had braced herself for something aggressive, something territorial, the claiming bite of a king making a point. What she found instead was something that moved like the tide moves, slow and inevitable and complete, building from something quiet into something vast, without ever losing the thread of gentleness that had been there from the first touch. The silver blight surged. She felt it, a sharp, violent resistance, as though something inside her had sensed what was coming and was throwing itself against the walls of its own cage. Her hands tightened on his wrists, her breath caught. For a moment, but the cold of the blight pressed in hard from all sides, the dark veins pulsing hot and resistant. Matthias did not pull away. He drew her closer instead, his arms coming around her, his warmth pressing against the cold, and she felt, slowly, painfully, like winter giving way, the blight's resistance begin to bend. They stayed in the water for a long time. When his teeth finally grazed the curve of her neck, gently, a warning, a question rather than an answer, she exhaled sharply and leaned into it, and the blight screamed, and then went very quiet. He had not marked her yet. He had stopped himself. When she looked at him questioningly, his eyes were intent and almost dark with what he was holding in check. "Not yet," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been, but his hands were still steady on her, still careful. "Not tonight. I want you to come to that decision in daylight, with a clear head." She searched his face. He looked back at her with those grey, clear eyes, and waited, the way mountains wait. And she thought, how strange. Of all the places I expected to find a man like this, of all the doors I expected that word safe to live behind. It was at that moment that the heavy furs at the chamber entrance moved. Gilbert stepped through. He looked at her. He looked at Matthias. His face was composed, carefully, deliberately composed, in the way of someone who was not surprised by what he was seeing but was pretending to be. "You need to hear something," he said. His voice was even, but there was a tightness around his eyes that she had never noticed before, or perhaps never been looking for, yet before tomorrow. Matthias kept one hand at the base of Luciana's spine. He did not move her away from him. He looked at Gilbert with the flat, patient attention of a man hearing out a subordinate he had already begun to distrust. "Then speak," he said. Gilbert exhaled. He looked at Luciana, and for a moment something flickered across his face that might have been shame, if it were allowed to be. "What I have to tell you," he said. "I should have said 3 months ago. The night of the Great Moor ceremony. Before any of this happened." He stopped. Started again. "Bailey's army has crossed the outer boundary of the ridge. They are a night's march from here." Luciana went still. Matthias's hand pressed steady at her back. "Why?" she said, very quietly. "Do you look like a man confessing rather than warning?" Gilbert closed his eyes, and the chamber went very cold. Chapter 5. "The tonic," Luciana said. It was not a question. It had stopped being a question the moment she saw Gilbert's face in the lamplight of the sacred springs, the moment she understood the specific quality of the shame she saw there. Gilbert opened his eyes. He looked at the ground between them. "The wolfsbane was in the tonic," she said. "Flat. Steady. Not breaking." "Yes." Matthias stood very still. The silence in the chamber was the kind of silence that lives in the space before a storm breaks. Not peaceful. Pressurized. "For how long?" she asked. "Since before the ceremony. Bailey ordered it the summer before." "How long, Gilbert?" 4 years. 4 years. She let the number sit inside her, and didn't look away from it. 4 years of drinking the tonic he prepared for her every second day, dutifully, because he was the head healer, and she trusted healers the way young wolves are taught to trust them. 4 years of believing her inability to shift was her own failure, her own insufficient blood, her own hollow soul. 4 years of shrinking herself smaller around a secret someone else was keeping. Something moved through her that she had no name for. It was too large and too complex to be simply anger, though anger was certainly in it. It was the particular devastation of understanding that the story you were told about yourself was deliberately constructed by someone else to serve their ends. She had not been weak. She had been poisoned. Matthias moved. He stepped past her and crossed the chamber in 3 long strides. He stopped 6 inches from Gilbert and looked down at him with an expression so purely contained that it was more frightening than rage would have been. "You are going to tell me," Matthias said, very quietly, "everything. Bailey's army size, their approach route, their intent." He paused. and then you are going to stay in this chamber under guard until I decide what comes next." Gilbert nodded. He spoke quickly. Bailey's force was 300 warriors. They were using the northern pass, the one that circled the Bone Ridge, rather than crossing it. They planned to arrive by nightfall tomorrow. Bailey believed he would find Luciana dead, or near enough to it. He expected Matthias to be isolated, unprepared, perhaps willing to negotiate. He had been wrong about all of it. Matthias listened without moving. When Gilbert had finished, he turned back to Luciana. She was standing where he had left her, in the center of the chamber, and she looked, not devastated, not collapsed, but distilled, as though 4 years of poison being named had burned away everything that wasn't essential, and what was left was something simpler and harder and more certain. "I need to mark you tonight," he said. His voice was not a question, not a demand. It was the clear, practical statement of a man who had just assessed a threat and understood the only path through it. She looked at him for a long moment. "That is what I came here for," she said. "That has not changed." "The marking will be different than what you expect," he said. "If what I think is in you is what I think it is, what do you think is in me?" He was quiet for a beat. "Though then, do you know the bloodline of the first moon?" She had heard the old stories, ancient tales told around the Dominion's fires, the kind of stories elders use when they want to explain why some wolves are what they are and others are not. The first moon bloodline, a line so old it predated the dens themselves, so old it predated the Dominion and the Ridge and all the territorial wars between them. A power sealed so deeply into the blood that it required a specific key to unlock it, a key that only one bloodline could provide. The bloodline of the Bone and Blood Kings. She looked at his hands, at the old scars, at the calm, unhurried certainty in his grey eyes. "You are serious," she said. "I have never been more serious about anything in my life." A pause. "If you are wrong, if I am wrong, or the marking will still save you from the blight and the bond will hold." His jaw was set. "But if I am right, if you are right, Bailey arrives tomorrow to find something other than what he came for." The corner of his mouth moved, that same complicated almost smile that was not quite humor, but was something adjacent to it. "Something other," he agreed. She breathed in. She looked around the chamber, the mineral-patterned walls, the deep blue water, the small brass lamp still burning on its rock ledge, steady and warm. She thought about 4 years. She thought about the white garment on the stone platform. She thought about the cold stone wall she had pressed her face against on the night she decided to stop dying quietly. She looked at Matthias. "I am choosing you," she said. "Not as a cure. Not because Bailey is coming, or because I am choosing you." He crossed the chamber to her. What happened in the Sacred Springs that night was not simply a marking. Later, Matthias would tell Henry that the moment he bit down, the moment his teeth broke skin, every fire in the bone lair surged simultaneously, burning twice as bright for 3 full seconds before settling. The great ridge rock of the walls had hummed, not loudly. A low, deep tectonic hum felt more in the chest than heard in the ears, the sound of something enormous adjusting to accommodate something new. Inside the Springs chamber, neither of them heard the fires or the hum. What Luciana felt was not pain. It was the opposite of the silver blight in every way. Where the blight had been cold and contracting and dark, this was warm and expanding and blazing, moving through her from the point of the mark outward like a flood tide filling a dry riverbed. It found the place where the wolfsbane had been sitting for 4 years and burned it out. It found the place where the rotting bond had been hanging like a dead weight and severed it cleanly. not with pain, but with a sudden, shocking absence of pain, the way a wound feels when the splinter is finally removed. It found something else, something deep down in a place she had not known existed. A locked room at the bottom of her soul that she had been told was empty, had been told was evidence of her hollow vessel nature, had been drinking poisoned tonic to prevent her from ever finding. It was not empty. It was waiting. The door opened, and Luciana threw back her head and howled. It was not the modest howl of a newly shifted wolf. It was not the formal howl of a dominion ceremony. It was something that began low in her chest and grew until it was beyond sound, beyond volume, a resonance that travelled through the rock of the bone lair, up through the roots of the black trees, across the ridge, across the valley, across every boundary stone and briar field, and blood-soaked ceremony ground in all the territories. Every wolf in the Thousand Oak Dominion, 300 warriors included, heard it and stopped dead in their tracks. Every wolf in Matthias's den heard it, and came immediately, fully awake, to the entrance of the bone lair, and looked up at the sky. The sky had gone dark. Not the darkness of night. It was full midday. The sky had gone dark the way the sky goes dark during an eclipse, in that alien, wrong, deeply unsettling way, as though the world had remembered something it had forgotten for a very long time, and was adjusting everything accordingly. Inside the Springs chamber, Matthias caught Luciana as her body began to change. It was not a smooth, graceful shift of the kind the Dominion's wolves performed in their ceremonies. It was a complete, rapid, total transformation, skin and bone and muscle rearranging themselves into something that had not existed in 1,000 years. Something massive, something shadow-black, the fur as dark as deep water. No light catching it anywhere. Eyes the colour of burning amber, lit from within. A shadow wolf. She stood in the sacred springs and filled the chamber, and the steam curled away from her in all directions, and Matthias stood before her, not backing away, not afraid, but looking at her with an expression that was something between awe and recognition. She looked back. She knew him. Even in this form, even in this ancient, primal shape she had never worn before. She knew him the way she knew her own heartbeat. He reached out and put one hand against the side of her massive jaw. She leaned into it. Outside, the sky held its darkness for 7 full minutes, and in the northern pass of the Bone Ridge, Bailey's 300 warriors stopped marching and looked at the sky and felt, for the first time in their lives, the specific cold of being on the wrong side of something far older and far more powerful than they had prepared for. Chapter 6. Bailey arrived in the valley below the bone lair just before dusk. Or he came the way kings come when they believe they are attending the conclusion of something, with ceremony and noise and the deliberate pageantry of someone who has already written the ending in their own head. His 300 warriors spread out across the valley floor in the old formations, shields and weapons visible, torches lit. He rode at their center on a grey mountain stallion, his fur cloak spreading behind him, his face arranged in the expression of someone dispensing justice. He had expected to find the bone lair battered and thinly defended. He had expected Matthias to receive him with the posture of a man caught off guard. He had expected Luciana to be dead, or close enough that she was irrelevant. He had expected wrong on all counts. Matthias's warriors lined the upper ridge of the valley's northern edge, not 300, but easily that number, deployed across the high ground with the patient efficiency of a force that had been in position for hours. They carried no torches. They did not need them. Their eyes were enough, points of amber and gold and deep blue in the coming dark, a wall of cold light against the tree line. Bailey pulled his stallion up short. The valley went quiet except for the wind. Henry came out from the Bone Lair's entrance and descended the rocky slope to the valley floor with his hands relaxed at his sides. He stopped 40 paces from Bailey's front rank. "You have come into King Matthias's valley without invitation," Henry said. His voice was the calm, factual voice of someone stating weather conditions. "While the king will speak with you if you come forward alone. Bring your warriors forward, and this becomes a different kind of meeting." Bailey looked at his warriors. He looked at the ridge. He did the simple mathematics of height advantage and defenders per meter, and came to the conclusion that charging was not the solution he had hoped it might be. He dismounted. He walked forward. Matthias was waiting in front of the Bone Lair entrance. He stood alone, arms crossed, in the same dark tunic and furs Luciana had first seen him in. He did not have a weapon drawn. He did not need one. He simply stood in the entrance to the place he had been born into, and looked at Bailey with the particular patience of someone who has already seen how this ends, and is willing to let it take the time it takes. Bailey stopped 10 paces from him, yet he was breathing harder than the walk should have made him breathe. "You have something that belongs to the Thousand Oak Dominion," Bailey said. "I have a woman who walked through your thorns and crossed your ridge and asked for shelter in my den." Matthias's voice was even. "Voluntarily. She is a rejected bond. She has no rights. She has the rights of any wolf who reaches my gate." Matthias looked at him for a moment. "You rejected her? The bond was yours to honor or refuse. You refused it. What comes next is not your territory." Bailey's jaw tightened. "She is carrying my dominion's blood." "She is carrying a great deal more than that." A pause. "You should know what you came here to kill, Bailey, before you decide whether you are still committed to the killing of it." Bailey looked around at the Bone Lair entrance, at the warriors on the ridge, at the valley that felt, in the strange dusk light, nothing like the valley it had been when his scouts described it to him 3 days ago. "Where is she?" he said. "Here." The voice came from above and behind Matthias, from the high ledge of rock that jutted above the Bone Lair entrance, where the cliff face caught the last of the light. Luciana stood there. She had not shifted back fully from the night before. She was in her human form now, but carrying the residue of the shift like weather carries the residue of a storm. She was dressed in deep grey furs that were far too large for her, and had clearly been borrowed from Matthias's own quarters. Her dark hair was loose, and her feet were bare on the cold rock of the ledge, and the silver blight was gone from her arm entirely. Not faded, not retreated, but gone, as though it had never been. She stood at the edge of the ledge above the valley, and looked down at Bailey. He looked up at her. 300 warriors on the ridge looked between them. Whatever Bailey had expected to find when he arrived at the Bone Lair, it had not been this. It had not been her upright and whole, and looking at him from the high ground, with eyes that held absolutely nothing he could use. No plea, no grief, no residual bond ache. Nothing. "You are the hollow vessel," he said. The words came out less certain than they had on the high stone. "I was poisoned," she said, calm, clear, carrying easily across the valley floor. 4 years of wolfsbane in my tonic. Gilbert has confessed. Every wolf in your dominion will know by morning." A sound moved through Bailey's warriors. Low, instinctive. The sound of people recalibrating. Bailey's face changed. "Whatever story you've constructed, the wolfsbane was still in my system when I arrived here," she said. "Your healer's mark is on the clay jars. 3 witnesses in your dominion saw Gilbert preparing them." She paused, letting that settle. "I am not constructing a story. I am reading you the one that already exists." Bailey turned to Matthias. "This changes nothing," he said. His voice had acquired the particular hard edge of a man who is not accustomed to having the narrative taken from him. "She is still on my territory's border. She still carries a bond claim. The bond is severed, Matthias said. By her hand. Not mine. Bailey turned back to her. She was looking at him with such complete, quiet stillness that it seemed to expand outward to fill the whole valley. And not coldness, not rage. Something beyond both. The stillness of someone who has burned completely through all the feeling that needed burning and arrived at the simple, immovable fact of themselves. Leave, she said, very quietly. You have no claim here. You have no right here. And you have no power over what I am anymore. Bailey stood very still for a long moment. And then she shifted. It was not the gradual, controlled shift of a trained wolf. It happened all at once, the way lightning happens. One moment she was standing on the ledge in Matthias's grey furs, and the next the shadow wolf stood there, massive against the dusk sky, fur as black as the space between stars, amber eyes burning like twin fires in the dark. Bailey's stallion screamed and bolted. Half of Bailey's front rank took 3 involuntary steps backward. Yet Bailey himself did not step back. He stood his ground. But his face, in the amber light of the shadow wolf's eyes, had gone the colour of the pale ridge rock. He had come here to kill a dying woman. He had found something that could not be killed by anything he had brought with him. Henry appeared at his shoulder, not touching him, not threatening, but present in the unmistakable way of someone who is managing a situation. The king suggests, Henry said pleasantly, that you take your warriors home. The valley will be clear for your passage for the next hour. After that, he glanced up at the ridge, where 200 amber and gold eyes watched from the dark. After that, the hour ends. Bailey looked at the shadow wolf on the ledge. He looked at the warriors on the ridge. He looked at Matthias standing in the bone lair entrance with the same unhurried patience he had walked into the valley with. He turned. He walked back to his warriors. He gave the order. And 300 soldiers of the 1,000 Oak Dominion began the long walk home. Matthias did not move until the last torch was gone from the valley. Then he turned and looked up at the ledge where Luciana stood in her human form again, her feet bare on the cold rock, her expression quiet. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Come down from there. You'll catch a chill." She almost laughed. It surprised her. The laugh, the way it arrived without permission, full and real, the kind of laugh that comes from the body rather than the mind. She climbed down. He met her at the base of the cliff and pulled the grey fur around her shoulders where it had slipped, and his hands were warm and steady on her shoulders, and she stood inside the circle of that warmth and let herself feel, fully and without armour, exactly how far she had come from the thin white garment on the stone platform. "Is it over?" she asked. He looked at the empty valley, at the retreating dark of Bailey's army, already swallowed by the tree line. "The war part," he said. "Yes." She leaned her head against his chest. He put his arms around her. "The rest of it," he said, and she could feel the rumble of his voice through the firs, "is just beginning." Chapter 7. The weeks that followed were not the clean, uncomplicated piece of a finished story. They were the complicated, the particular kind of work that happens when one era is ending and another has not yet fully begun. Matthias's scouts were in motion constantly, riding the boundaries of the Bone Ridge territory and the outer territories of the Dominion's former allies. Word had spread faster than any horse could carry it. The Shadow Wolf walks again. The hollow vessel is hollow no more. The sanguine claim has been made. Dens that had quietly aligned with the 1,000 Oak Dominion for generations sent messengers. Some came with caution and formal language. Some came with bare faces and direct questions. A few came with the old gesture of submission. the turned jaw, the presented wrist, that the ancient Dens used when they acknowledged a new power had arrived, and they wished to acknowledge it on their own terms, rather than have it demonstrated to them. Luciana stood beside Matthias in every meeting. This was, she understood quickly, more deliberate than incidental. He did not consult her publicly in the formal way. He simply never moved to the center of the room without positioning himself so that she was visible, so that every wolf who came to bend toward him had to look at her and reckon with her in the same motion. It was a way of announcing a thing without the announcement, the way the landscape announces itself, not by declaring what it is, but simply by being it. She learned the bone lair. She learned its rhythms, its people, its particular vocabulary of silences and gestures that any close community develops over years. She learned that Henry's quiet was the most reliable indicator of his opinion on any given subject. The quieter he got, the more he disagreed with what was being said. She learned that Jude, for all his cold-eyed efficiency in the field, kept a collection of smooth stones on a ledge in his sleeping chamber, arranged by color, which she found one morning when she passed his open door and stopped dead and stared at for a full 10 seconds before moving on. She trained. The Shadow Wolf was not a simple thing to inhabit. It was enormous and ancient and full of instincts that did not always correspond to the situation at hand, responses calibrated for a world 1,000 years gone, a world where the threats were different, and the landscape was different, and the rules were written in blood rather than treaty. She worked with Matthias in the mornings in the valley's lower clearing, shifting and holding the form and learning the particular weight of it, at the particular reach of senses that made the human world feel thin and overlit by comparison. He was a patient teacher. Not gentle, he did not soften the hard parts, did not tell her it was easier than it was, but patient in the way of someone who has absolute confidence in the outcome and is therefore content to let the process take the time it takes. One morning, after a particularly demanding session, she sat on a flat boulder at the edge of the clearing and watched him practice his own shifts. Not the Shadow Wolf, just the ordinary shift, the functional, daily practiced motion of a wolf who has been doing this since childhood, smooth as breathing. She watched his body move through the change and thought about what it meant to inhabit yourself completely, to know what you were without anyone else's permission. She thought about the girl in the thin white garment. She thought about the poisoned tonic. She thought about the 4 years, she thought. I am not angry at the girl I was then. She survived. She kept moving forward, even when forward was unclear. She crossed a ridge she had no business crossing, and she knocked on a door she was not certain would open, and she walked through the dark. That girl had gotten her here. That girl was worth something. The union ceremony came on the night of the new moon, the same moon the Dominion's tradition claimed for secrets and sharp knives. Matthias had chosen it deliberately, and she understood why. There was a clarity to it. The Dominion had used the new moon for hiding things. They would use it for declaring them. There was no high stone. There was no crowd in their formal best, or pressed together in the valley, hoping for spectacle. There was the Bone Lair's outer ledge, cut from the cliff face, overlooking the valley below where Matthias's territory spread in the dark. The black trees, the distant thread of the underground river that fed the sacred springs, the far faint lights of his warriors' fires at the boundary camps. Matthias stood at her right. Henry and Jude and Renna and a handful of the Bone Lair's oldest warriors stood at their backs, not as an audience, but as witnesses in the old way, the way the ancient Dens witnessed things, by being present and saying nothing, letting the silence carry the weight. There was no ceremony language, no formal declaration, no king on a stone proclaiming who she was. She had already decided who she was. Matthias turned to her. His grey eyes were clear in the dark, though catching the faint light of the stars. He lifted one hand and ran the backs of his fingers along her jaw, unhurried, the way he did everything, and she leaned into it in the way she had come to recognize as simply what her body did when he was near. Not performance, not decision, just truth. 2 alphas, he said, very quietly, just for her. 1 shadow, she said. He smiled, fully this time, the real version, the one she had been slowly coaxing out of him in the mornings over the weeks since the Valley confrontation, the one that made him look younger, and less like a king, and more like a man who was pleased with how things had turned out. She kissed him. He kissed her back with the same careful, complete attention he brought to everything, both hands in her hair, her pressed against the warmth of his chest, neither of them in any hurry, because there was nothing ahead that required hurrying, and nothing behind that needed running from. When they stepped apart, she turned to the valley below. She breathed in. She howled. It began low, lower than the human throat should produce, something resonant and ancient, drawing from a depth inside her that the shadow wolf had opened and the sanguine claim had sealed. It built without effort, without strain, the way the tide builds, and it grew until it was above sound and below it simultaneously, filling the valley and the ridge and the black trees and the cold air above the distant fires of the boundary camps. Below, in the valley, every warrior in Matthias's territory lifted their head. One by one they answered. Then the dens beyond the ridge answered. The neutral territories answered. The former allies of the Dominion who had sent their messengers and their cautious formal letters answered. Howls rising from distances so great they should have been inaudible, but were not, because what Luciana was calling across the dark was not merely sound. It was presence. It was declaration. It was the specific, unmistakable announcement of something that had been sealed for 1,000 years, announcing that the seal was broken, the waiting was done. The time of hollow vessels and poisoned tonics and small white garments handed to women who deserved better was finished. The sky above the bone lair filled with howls the way the sky fills with stars, one by one, and then all at once, and then impossible to count. Matthias stood at her shoulder and listened. After a while she stopped howling. She let the echoes die away through the valley. She stood with her bare feet on the cold stone of the ledge and looked out over the dark of the territory and breathed. "What happens to the 1,000 Oak Dominion?" she asked. "It absorbs," he said, quietly. "Bailey's lieutenants are already sending word. Without the Wolfsbane story, he might have held things together. With it..." He let that sentence end itself. She thought about the Dominion, the great oaks, the blood-red sky, the cold stone halls where she had made herself smaller and still never been quite small enough. "I don't want it destroyed," she said. "The wolves there didn't poison me. The trees didn't poison me." "No," he agreed. "The structures can remain. The den can continue." She paused, with new blood at the head. He was quiet for a moment. "That is a generous position," he said, not challenging it, noting it. "It is a practical one," she said. "A territory that has been destroyed spends 2 generations rebuilding itself before it is useful to anyone. A territory that has been restructured," she looked at him, "starts being useful immediately." Henry, somewhere behind them, made a very quiet sound that was almost certainly him not laughing. Matthias looked at her with those grey eyes, and the particular expression she had come to understand was his version of being deeply, helplessly impressed with someone. 2 alphas, he said again. 1 shadow, she replied. 3 moons after the night, Bailey walked his army home from the valley. The 1,000 Oak Dominion's elders sent a delegation to the Bone Lair. They came in peace. They came with the old gestures. They came with the news that Gilbert had been stripped of his position and exiled to the outer territories, that Bailey had stepped back from the title of Alpha King under the combined pressure of the revelation and the loss of 300 warriors' confidence, and that the Dominion's cradles were prepared to receive new governance. They had one question, the eldest among them, a white-muzzled female with a face so lined by age it had become beautiful in the way that weathered rock becomes beautiful, looked at Luciana across the stone table of the Bone Lair's main chamber and said, "Will you come back to us?" Luciana looked at Matthias. He looked back at her. He gave her nothing. No direction, no suggestion, no opinion. Just his steady, unhurried presence. She looked at the elder. "I will come back to you," she said. "Well, not as the hollow vessel. Not as anything Bailey named me." She paused. "I will come back as what I am." "And what are you?" the elder asked. Luciana sat with the question for a moment. "I am the woman who crossed the Bone Ridge," she said. "I am the Shadow Wolf. I am Matthias's bonded. I am the one the first moon sealed, and the poison could not reach forever." She looked at the old wolf steadily. "I am the one you owe 4 years to." The elder held her gaze for a long time. Then she tipped her head. Not a bow exactly. Something older than a bow. A gesture from before the dens had language for what they were doing, when wolves simply lowered their eyes before a presence too large to stare at directly. "Then we will wait for you," the elder said. The legend of Luciana does not end there. The ancient storytellers do not record an ending to it, which is perhaps the most honest thing the old stories ever did, because the lives of people who have genuinely come into their own do not end, they continue, and the continuing is the whole point. What they record is this, that the Thousand Oak Dominion and the Bone Lair became, in time, the largest unified territory in the ancient lands, that the great oaks along the boundary were carved with new sigils, not the warning language of the old boundary stones, but the declaration language of a realm that did not need to warn anyone because it did not fear anything, that Gilbert lived out his exile without comfort and without company, which was considered mercy by those who knew the full extent of what he had done, that Bailey was seen, once, years later, as in a distant neutral territory, grey and quiet and carrying no title, and that no one bothered him, and he bothered no one. And the old stories say that this was also mercy, though of a different kind. That Matthias and Luciana ruled as what they had declared themselves to be from the beginning. 2 alphas, 1 shadow. Not 1 king and 1 queen, not 1 power and 1 consort, but 2 equal forces moving in the same direction, which is rarer and more difficult and more powerful than any single king on any high stone has ever been. And the storytellers say that on every new moon, on the same night, the hollow vessel walked out of the Dominion and began the crossing of the Bone Ridge. The Shadow Wolf's howl could be heard from one edge of the United Territory to the other. Not a cry, not a warning, just a presence, declaring itself, but alive and whole, and exactly where it had decided to be. This has been another legend from Marked by Midnight. If you felt the cold of the Thousand Oak Dominion, if you felt the warmth of the sacred springs, if you felt the moment the sky went dark at midday, then you are exactly where you belong. Hit that like button. Subscribe so you never miss a legend. And tell me in the comments, if your fated mate had rejected you and left you to die, would you have found the courage to cross the Bone Ridge? The moon is still rising. There are more legends to tell, and the hunt has only just begun.